thank you. Oh, my mic is working. Thank you very much, Gus, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for actually being willing to entertain a topic that is not a typical topic for this series, and for not scheduling me on a home game day, which is always a bonus. And thank you all for coming out in this chilly morning. So I'm going to try and do a whirlwind overview of something that could easily be either a semester-long course or longer than that. And you're welcome at the end to ask questions if there are things that I have completely not covered or just alluded to. So let's see if this is actually working. Technology is always harder when it's projection. So I'm just going to start. I know most of you know what a computer is, but just to understand what the direction that I'm trying to show trends in. There's a lot to talk about, obviously. This is what I would call a definition of a regular computer from Oxford dictionaries. But I would point out, especially to this audience, that electronic computers really started off as machines to do mathematical calculations. And that's an important thing to bear in mind, especially when we look at the history, early history. I was already asked by someone this morning if I'm going to show this, and I actually, luckily, had a slide already ready. This is a bit more of a specific definition of a computer, of course, from scientific Wikipedia. But the image is the interesting thing here. It's Colossus, which was the first electronic, digital, programmable computing device. It was used during World War II to break German ciphers in the United Kingdom. The programmable part is what makes it possible for all of us to actually do our work these days in science. The reason I've got it up, as Gus alluded to, one of my big passions is diversity and history of women in computing, and hopefully the future of women in computing. Women actually used to be human mathematical calculators. Then they became naturally early computer operators, what we would now call system administrators or sysadmins. And when computers came in, the reason this was a natural move for them was not necessarily because of their capabilities that were greater than men. It was because they were paid less than men. So that was always a bonus. And if you've seen Hidden Figures, that is actually something that was a lot broader even in the cases they describe. So since the early days of computers, people have been trying to make computers bigger and bigger, more and more powerful, to solve bigger and bigger mathematical problems. It doesn't mean that all problems are huge or need them, but that's what drives the creation of computers. So if you fast forward about 20 years from the Colossus to the CDC 6600, which was generally considered, and of course that tells you that there are differing opinions in the community, to be the first successful computer. You can see the primary customers were all national labs and Department of Energy related. Just showing the stats on the side, I won't go through them, but just to have a definition, a calculation in this case, it's a mathematical or logical operation, like adding two numbers together or subtracting one from the other. And I was asked an interesting question, actually, by Brad Orr last week when I was talking to him. And he said, so what do these numbers mean? You know, when you think about it in ovens power or hairdryer power. So I have now invented a new metric, and it is called the how many hairdryers is this power draw equivalent to? And that is my new symbol for it. So this was back in 1964, and it drew the power of 20 hair dryers, current hair dryers that would be on high, which take about 1,500 watts today. So when you think about it, you and your house, an American house uses a couple of kilowatts a day. This was using 30 kilowatts back in 1964. So that was more powerful even than 10 houses now. The only other historical one I have to show, and I've seen a Cray one in person, and it is awesome for those of us who really like hardware and things like that. The bench has been defined around it, has been called the most expensive bench ever. But it's very famous for many reasons. Some of it is what it did, some of it is what it looked like. It's an exotic supercomputer. It looked nothing like mainframes at the time, and it could do things that no other computer could do. So you see that we're still looking at the same people buying these supercomputers. The hairdryer metric is now up to 77 hairdryers on full blast. But one thing to note there is this was the first one that used something that's called a vector processor. It takes a one-dimensional array of numbers called vectors and operates on this vector, rather than taking individual numbers. So obviously for almost any mathematical calculation, this is something that speeds it up. This was something that Seymour Cray built back in 1977, and it cost a good chunk of money even then, 7.9 million, which would be a lot more even now. So one thing I want to point out, in the right image, you can see if you look carefully, once you move that bench away and open this up, you can see a couple of things. You can see it was really tight in there, but you can also see that there's a lot of cables. Those blue-white things are the cables. So those, if you've been involved with hardware, you know that hardware constantly needs care and feeding. Things go wrong all the time. Things break down. So you had to be able to get into that little space and fix it. So guess what? It worked out really well that it was still women doing the operations. And those were the glory days of people who had very not broad shoulders. So we moved on about in about 1994 to an era when lots of people wanted to use supercomputers. They had uses for them, but they didn't have that $8 million in their back pocket to pay for them. So Thomas Sterling, who is still a faculty member at Indiana University, and Donald Beckert from NASA figured out ways to take off-the-shelf commodity hardware, and that is jargon for you could walk into a store like Best Buy and buy some PCs and hook them together in a way that allowed you to have your own supercomputer. The connections are important, but you didn't have to build a machine from scratch like the Cray. This is important. It's not just an anecdote. This is the basis for most supercomputers today. Whether they're called Beowulf clusters or not, even the largest ones come from this same kind of concept. The definition for Beowulf clusters is here. This is how Beowulf.org, which is the official one, defines it. But like very many other things in supercomputing, it's a very loose and vague definition. But we call everything computing clusters now, and I'll probably regress to saying that very soon because I'm not used to saying supercomputers. It's just a trend in naming more than anything else. So jumping ahead to today, end of last year, it still is hard to define what a supercomputer is. People say it's like asking you to define what a car is. It's really hard to define what a car is, but obviously if someone asked you the difference between a Toyota Camry and a Ferrari, you'd be able to point it out. So this one is a Ferrari. This is the fastest computer in the world today, with the disclaimer that that is of the ones that are actually visible and do the tests to be in the competition. So that precludes things like all of Amazon's vast array of computers, Google's, and all these invisible government computers that no one knows about. So just to get a feel for this, we're at the 6,731 hair dryers metric at this point. This is a computer that is used for a broad spectrum of uses, most of them scientific. If you made a calculation every single second for the next 6.3 billion years, you would do what this computer, Summit, can do in 1 second at its peak theoretical speed. So the reason you may have seen a lot of press about this has less to do with the capabilities and more to do with the fact that China overtook the US dominance in supercomputing a couple of years ago and was at the top of the top 500 list for a couple of years, and we are back at the top of the list now. And this is for 6 months until the next list comes out. It may change. The important thing also is that we now judge things on a green 500 list. So just by giving things a lot of power and beefing up things in that way is not considered the best way anymore. So a green 500 list basically looks at how much power you use per your computational power. And this is number 2 on the list right now. So when those two things converge, it is a very good thing. One last, we're getting close to the end of seeing any computers in this talk. I took a generic kind of feel for what academic campus computing clusters are, with the definition being clusters that are used by a number of researchers on campus, usually provided by a center or by the university itself. So you can see there's a lot of breadth here to the numbers. I'll just quickly mention that we at the University of Michigan have just made available a brand new cluster. This picture is actually the old one. Our new cluster is called Great Lakes. It costs $4.8 million. It's got 23,000 computing cores in it. It supports over 300 U of M research projects, over 2,500 users, and their collaborators, of course, from other institutions. This one I put up for 2 reasons. One of them, if you look at those yellow cables that you can see all over the place, those are what actually allow the different computers to talk to each other, and they're very much like those white, blue ones you saw in the Cray. The other thing is, when you look at all those hair dryers, it's physics. They're creating a lot of heat. If you don't want your computers to melt down or be on fire, you have to cool them. There are lots of ways to cool them, and I could do a whole course just on data centers, which I find very exciting, but I don't know that everyone else does. This is actually a way of cooling that is different than most of them. This is an ambient air-cooled data center, which means it's like opening the window when your house is too hot and it's cooler outside. And so it doesn't take a whole lot of power to cool like other things do. If you're using chilled water, you need to put power into chilling it. If you're using cooling fans, you need to put energy into that. This one, for most of the year, at least until we started having those really 90-degree days for weeks on end, this does pretty well without that. And this is actually a fact of life when you're running supercomputers. In the old days, people basically cooled down the machine rooms to a point where you had to wear a parka, even if you were if it was summer. In reality, all you need, again, it's physics, all you need is to have the air be a little bit cooler, but circulating cooler than what the machines create to keep them safe. So this is these are my attempts at defining what a supercomputer is. Here's a little bit of terminology. At the end of the day, the important ones to know are that we call these things clusters, we call them computing clusters, we call them high-performance computers, we call them supercomputers. We all mean the same thing. After seeing these different examples, it's obviously not about size and speed, because I just showed you a range of things that had different sizes and different speeds, yet they were all supercomputers. It's about what it can do and how it does it. And that is the attempt at the top definition to say. Mainly the fact is that there are many processors working together to solve a problem together. Again, think about how do you define a car. It's hard. The interconnect that I've defined here are those yellow cables, or the white-blue ones in the cray, and that's important. So at this point, usually I get asked if an iPhone is a supercomputer. So any iPhone, even an iPhone 4, was actually faster than the supercomputers that NASA used to get to the moon. However, it is not a supercomputer by my definition, at least by this one here. It doesn't solve problems by having lots of identical computers do the same thing. And in fact, your iPhone spends most of its time worrying about how to interact with you, the owner, and how to interact with all its accelerometers and all its sensors on it, and putting up the graphics. So that is not what we would call a supercomputer normally, even though it is a very, very strong computer. This was, Gus and I were talking about it. The power outage in California, you may not think, first of all, of the supercomputers, but Lawrence Berkeley Lab, first thing they had to do, of course, was shut down their supercomputers. They're national providers from Department of Energy machines. So everything, at least in my life, has some impact on supercomputing, and so do the power outages there. Hopefully we'll get back. The problem really isn't necessarily running the supercomputer, it's really making sure that it can be cooled. So I'm going to quickly go through traditional applications for supercomputers. Anyone who's been in a lot of these talks have probably seen images pretty much like this. The important thing to realize is that the traditional applications for supercomputers, and that doesn't mean that they don't continue now, and it doesn't mean that they're not a whole lot more powerful and complex than they were back in 1960, but they're still being used for the same kind of disciplines. They were used for mathematical calculations. They still are used for mathematical calculations, what we call number crunching. So these are some examples. A lot of these things are solving a lot of partial differential equations, for example. There's computational fluid dynamics involved in many of them. There's Monte Carlo, finite element methods. These are all things that cross a lot of boundaries. Here you see an aerodynamics calculation for the space shuttle. You see an explosives simulation to see how it interacts with electromagnetic radiation, so that people could hopefully be at a safe distance while detonating explosives. We've got some synthetic data creation examples. You use it for reference, for real data, for example, for test data. One's a Category 5 hurricane. The other one is an image actually from Gus. Synthetic, he was talking about his synthetic sky models. This is one of them. Quickly, other things, climate, of course, weather forecasting as well as climate. So these are actually real weather prediction simulations. The one on the left is for Hurricane Sandy's trajectory in 2012. The other one is a simulation of global water surface temperatures. And that is something that is needed to be able to actually simulate climate change. And that would be the right image. Molecular dynamics, very traditional use of these computers. That's my background as well. Ice melting, it is incredibly hard to simulate and to model ice and water. Still modeling that. That's on the right. That is ice melting from the inside. And then on the left, it's one of the uses that have evolved over time, which is modeling for creation of new materials. In this case, self-healing ceramics and glasses, to see how structural behavior can change how the material itself behaves. Lastly, when you don't want or you can't do the actual experiment in real life, the one on the right is actually the simulation of fluids, coolants in a nuclear reactor. So that's the when you really don't want to do the experiment in real life. Seeing the turbulence and the chaotic behavior of it to try and build better, safer reactors. The one on the left is actually from the Atlas detector at CERN in the Large Hadron Collider experiment. This is actually used to be able to create more data than they can create there, to analyze their data. There's a lot of uses, and there are thousands of people across the country who are actually working on these kind of things, and across the world. So jumping ahead to the newer applications, because those are the ones that I think will be newer to you, although I think you probably have heard about a lot of them. And again, there is a complete continuation of the original ones as well, and they're getting bigger and they're getting more complex. But the thing is that when traditional calculations started, they started smaller because that was the available power then, computing power then, and they have increasingly grown as the power has grown. With these new applications, many of them started, it didn't go from 0 to 90 gradually. It started at 90. And this is this is a new thing in many disciplines and in many departments here at the university and across the world. And these things include things like genomics that just weren't, people didn't do that kind of thing more than a decade ago. And all these other simulations and a lot of machine learning. And machine learning, of course, has been around for a very long time. It's a stats methodology area, but they didn't have the computers to do these huge amounts of calculations at the time. And you can see that machine learning, for example, is now in scientific fields as well. This is just the tip of the iceberg, what I've basically pointed out here. So how did this happen? Why is this suddenly possible? One of them, and we use big data, I always use it in quotes because everyone thinks of big data as something else. But the sources, the fact there's so much data around, I mean, the sensors, we're all sitting here with sensors on us, right? If we've got our phones on us, we've got our Fitbits on us. We've got network access points here that if we're connected to them are getting data on us. The internet itself, there's no end of data out there. And I will note that researchers and companies use every bit of this data all the time, but that's a spoiler for the rest of my slides here. Also, the capabilities of computers have grown by a lot. Things are cheaper to build. Memory, which is an important part of being able to do a lot of these things, is now cheaper. You can transfer data much easier than the old way, which was called sneakernet, which basically meant you tied on your sneakers and you took your hard drive and moved it from place to place. So, and the other thing just that is important, because I've talked about machine learning, is graphic processing units that actually started in game consoles. You have them in your phone, you have them still in your Xboxes, but at some point people looked at them and said, you know what, we could use this as a programmable device and use it for anything that uses the same kind of operations on a lot of data at the same time, which we used to call single instruction multiple data back in the old days, but now it's called GPUs. So these are very important, and they're very useful for many things, also for physics simulations as well, and molecular dynamics. So to give you a feel of what big means in big data, the Library of Congress, which is the central repository in this country, if it were digitized completely, would have 15 terabytes in it. I can grant you that there are people sitting in this room who have created more than 15 terabytes this year. So when you look at that compared to all these new sources of data, they get dwarfed. Petabytes are the next one up. There are 1,000 terabytes in a petabyte, and yet Facebook gets 4 petabytes of new data every day created on it. The estimate for 2025 was made a couple of years ago, and I think people have already started second-guessing that. And they've had to start using, if you go look in Wikipedia, after exabytes, there's some other words to be used, and people have started using it. There are other units that are going to have to be used. But if you look, 212 million DVDs per day full of data. And that's what we know about. So let me attempt to do a highly technical thing here and run on a Windows laptop, which I have not used for decades.
Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal.
No, I didn't remember your shortcuts. So these were the concerns and fears of early supercomputers. This is just an example that may be familiar to many of you.
Hello, Hal, do you read me?
Oh.
Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do you read me, Hal? Do you read me, Hal? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Hello, Hal, do you read me? Do
Okay,
you
this
read me,
was
Hal?
meant to start
Affirmative, Dave.
a little bit further,
I
but
read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
that's okay.
What's the problem?
Can I stop it? So I would recommend anyone who hasn't seen that movie lately see it again, because it is great. However, this was a fear. Thanks. This is the fear that computers would become sentient, and that they would decide of their own free will to start harming humans. So that isn't what concerns me regularly. What concerns me are some other things that I think we all need to be thinking about. That was my backup. So here just, I've put in a lot of places, I've just put in article headlines that you can actually go and look at them later and find out what the articles were about. But when supercomputers just calculated numbers, we didn't have any of these concerns. Also, things weren't needing to be in real time, like everything connected really is now. And think about connected cars, for example. You know, it's very different from I'm going to put my simulation in a queue and wait for it to run. There's data being created that has to be analyzed, and it has to be done now, kind of thing. And it just wasn't personal then. The data wasn't so clearly attached to us all and to our well-being as a lot of these applications are. So I'm going to move on to describe some of the main problems I can think of right now. I frame them as problems not because they're not solvable, but because they mostly are. So this isn't a doom and gloom thing. It is definitely not HAL. We're not there yet. So this is a problem. Almost every one of these things are both a problem and a great thing. So problem number one, and this is not ranked by how boring I think they are. The knowledge is more than the sum of its parts. So if you look at this image, there's a chemotherapy ward co-presence network, which basically means the circles are patients. Their color is based on when they were in the chemotherapy ward. January 2000 is one color, red is December 2008. And patients are connected by this graph that you can see, by this network, when they were both in the chemotherapy ward at the same time, more than you'd expect it to be just by chance. They just happened to be there. So NIH researchers use tools like this, mixing in other data, which is the important part of what I'm talking about here, And they found that cancer patients were a little more likely to survive for 5 years or more after chemotherapy if they interacted during chemotherapy with other patients who also survived for 5 years or more. So there's a little bit of a cyclic definition in there, and it's not clear that you can tell if you should be hanging out, who you should be hanging out with, because you don't know if they're going to survive for 5 years. However, this is an NIH study. But here is what we see. You can see data of different types were used together. They were consolidated to create new knowledge from the connections between the different types. Analyzing each of these things separately would not have given any kind of conclusion like this. So again, this is great, but it's also the fact that you may think, oh, it's just this data, it's this data. It's not segregated. It's not segregated anymore because it can be put together. And knowledge is more than the sum of the parts. People say this to me, people even from my community. They tell me very proudly, I don't use social media. And so, you know, I don't have a digital footprint. So here's the good news and the bad news. You have a lot of digital footprint, even if you're not on Facebook or on LinkedIn or on Twitter. One thing that is the first thing that comes to mind is genome sequencing. I'm sure there are many people in this room who've had their genome sequenced partially, maybe by 23andMe or by Ancestry.com, or for medical purposes. Sequencing even part of a genome creates a huge amount of data. We're talking about terabytes, as you saw, per day created by these sequencing machines. So I won't go into how it's done, but part of the sequencing goes through supercomputing, and it's used by aligning together fragments, which is what creates the actual knowledge from it. The line here is Moore's Law, which you've probably heard of, and basically says that you can put double the number of transistors every 18 months on a chip, which means it's the law for how the power grows of supercomputers. You can see this is logarithmic, but you can see that sequencers' price has gone down in a way that is even more profound than supercomputing prices have gone down. So just to talk a little bit more about this, because I have not yet mentioned all these things that I guess we notice, but it may be in the back of our mind. Anything that does predictive analysis and is using your data is actually a huge digital footprint. If you own an Android phone, which I do, or use any Google products, which everyone, even with an iPhone, does, they know all about you. And this one about Google knows you better than you know yourself has to do also with this consolidation. They're taking information from various ways and putting it together. And one of the statements now is Google knows you better than your mother does, too. That's another one. But it really is better than you yourself know, because you don't necessarily even know your trail of data. This facial recognition, which it's a thing. You may know it or may not know it, but there are cameras out in public domain, and they're streaming data. New York Times took $100 worth of computing power and basically identified from 3 cameras in Manhattan, identified members of the faculty from a nearby university by using their website and facial recognition. That was $100, and it was done by journalists. So basically, the tools are out there for anyone. Reagan National and Dulles, as of the end of this year, claim they're going to use only facial recognition for boarding passes. A friend of mine was telling me yesterday, she came in on global entry. She stood in front of what looked like an iPad. It spat out her name and all her information. She didn't even have to type anything in. So, not to talk too much about it, I've got something on my wrist that has 3 sensors at least, right? A GPS, a heart rate tracker, and a pedometer. If you have one of the new Apple watches, it can do your EKG as well. So it all goes into the cloud, because I have very helpfully created an account so I can use the app, given it my information. It now knows, all sorts of things about me. My email address, which is pretty unique to be able to tie me into everything. OnStar knows all about you. If you've got built-in navigation, it knows all about you. Does anyone have an Alexa? It knows all about you. And, and these are things that you just have to bear in mind. You make the decision whether it's worth it for you or not. But when we talk about things like this is a functional MRI, which is used for researchers to understand what areas of the brain light up when you are doing certain things or when you're feeling certain things. This was not originally considered personal health information because it's just images. But turns out that there's a train of thought that says that you can actually identify people by the shape of their skull or by the venous structure in their brains. So it is identifiable. But then even without that, when all that data is sitting there, it can be hacked. Even if it's de-identified, because of this consolidation possibility from other data sources, it can be re-identified. It's not saying that you can just go and do it in 3 seconds, but it can be re-identified. De-identification is not the end-all, because even when you de-identify data, you usually de-identify some unique identifier. You leave a lot of other things not de-identified because it would be useless for you otherwise. And then that can be tied into other publicly available data. So I do have to give a public service announcement type of thing and say that data that you provide is generally not covered by HIPAA, for example, unless it's for clinical care. So all my Fitbit data, or your EKGs, or your genes data from private companies were not through clinical care. So they are actually not even covered by HIPAA. But that being said, as someone who has to worry about things like restrictions on sensitive data, all HIPAA does is it's been defined as an exercise in risk management. It basically says who goes to jail if there's a problem. It doesn't have a checklist of best practices necessarily, not from the government at least, of how to use it. So you have to keep that in mind. If the data, people always said, if you don't want to see it on a billboard, don't send that email, right? So in a way, data is becoming like that as well. And 23andMe, if you read their privacy page, they say, hey, stuff could happen, and your identity could be. I can read you the exact. It says, in the event of a data breach, it is possible that your data could be associated with your identity, which could be used against your interests. So there you are. And I'm not talking about them specifically. That could be any health provider as well. So faster calculations are always better. Well, apparently not, because our financial systems are not built for computers to do the trading. They can crash the market because they're so fast. They were built for the speed of human traders. So this is a problem. If it's not an end-to-end computerized kind of thing, then it isn't necessarily going to be a good thing to have one part of it being able to do things so quickly. Lastly, which I always find very interesting, past performance actually might be a guarantee of really bad future results. If you look at these headlines, and this goes on and on, right? Connect originally didn't work for anyone but males between the ages of 18 to 35. You can guess why that is, because that's who wrote the software for it. When a woman took it home and tried it with her family, there's an article about that, she found that it didn't react to kids and it didn't react to women who were generally shorter or smaller. So the people who are writing your software and creating your devices and creating things that actually are used for decisions about who's going to be a risk for recidivism in jails, these people are relying on data that they have, most of it from the past. So when Amazon is trying to increase its diversity, by finding a way to get more women in, yet using resumes of all the men only who have worked in Amazon for the past decades, you know, it's not going to help. And I would note that HR, there is a lot of HR in many companies that still use artificial intelligence, and you have to ask, what are they using for their data? So that was the part of what we need to be thinking about. Is it really all bad? No, it really isn't. I've alluded to that, and I have a couple of examples of things that are just really good for us. Can we deal with these issues? Yes, there are ways to deal with these issues. So quickly going through these, we know everyone's built differently. We know everyone has different specific disease outcomes and symptoms. We have not been able to deal with that very well in the past. But now personal health information tied in together with physics-based calculations and simulations can actually help in cardiovascular or vascular surgery or study of diseases. And these things, sometimes these studies are actually being done before surgery with a specific patient's data to be able to know what they're going to run into when they do the actual surgery. So it's obvious why the outcomes will be better. Precision medicine that you hear about a lot is not actually personalized medicine. Precision medicine basically means I'm going to use something that is suitable for your exact tumor, for example, that I've tested. But this is personalized. This is actually about you, and I'm going to use that to help your outcomes. So that is very exciting. I basically just did some Google searches. Look at the numbers in gray under each of these searches. Obviously, it's Google search, so sometimes it goes off on weird tangents, and those numbers may not be exact, and there might be duplicates. But this is also a thing now, using machine learning, artificial intelligence for tumor detection, for cancer detection. I mean, this is something that is helping. If you want to look up, you can see Google end of last year developed a deep learning tool that they say can identify metastasized breast cancer with 99% accuracy and could reduce the time it takes for clinicians to review pathology slides. This is great. If you need treatment, you get it quicker. If you don't need treatment, you get the stress over with quicker. It reduces fatigue for people who've been working all day. It reduces the subjectivity, and it just makes everything a lot quicker. But notice who the researchers were working for. Quickly showing something that is not to do with medicine or natural sciences or engineering. This is actually using machine learning to try and see what is written inside some very charred scrolls from the time of the Pompeii eruption of Vesuvius. It just actually, I think CNN just had something about this as well. You can't unroll them, they're charred, they're covered with ash. And you can't see, by imaging, you can't see a whole lot. But computers can see. If you train them to see what the signature for letters are, then they will work very hard, and even hundreds of layers in, they'll be able to see it. So you can get to new data from this. And the bonus here is there's no personal data here. So the commercial communities have paid attention. And if you've never, and I see my image moved on top of it, but if you've never seen anything about digital agriculture, I would recommend you go and read about it. It is astounding. They use more cyber infrastructure than we have at this university, just for one large field, I think. And they use drones, and they use robotics, and they use it for decision making. And every plant has a sensor, and every one of the livestock has a sensor, and it is astounding. Oil and gas have always used it, but now they're using it more and more. Digital construction is a new thing that's coming, but there's a lot of discussion about smart buildings, things like that. And they're using it for safety as well. Banks, I think most of us know, credit card fraud, for example. That is the flip side of using sources of data in a way that could cause you harm. When you wake up on Saturday morning and your bank has sent you email saying somebody in Texas just spent $629 at Best Buy, was it you? Because they're pretty sure I'm in Ann Arbor, then I'm happy to have that. And they invariably are right. It really wasn't me. And that's amazing. But that's also because I've given the bank a lot of information to be able to deduce things. This one is my second attempt to run a clip. The screen is blank here. And I've got the screensaver. And this, as we know, yeah, we were close. As we know, it's much easier to write something that will run on a supercomputer than it is to get a projector to work. So, there's also this, gaming and entertainment uses.
Dark rooms hide secrets, and mountains are fierce and bold. Deep waters hold reflections of times lost long ago. I will hear every story take hold of my own dream. Be as strong as the seas are stormy, and clouds and eagles scheme. I will rise, I will fly, chase the wind and touch the sky. I will fly, chase the wind and touch the sky.
These are actually just for her hair. Because it was so important for them to have a movie. But look at it moving. That's a lot of harmonic oscillators and strings used to simulate that. So just for numbers, thank you. Yes. So when they created a movie, even back in 2013, for example, Monsters University, the stats for that is they had 2,000 computers that altogether had more than 24,000 processing cores on them. It still took 25 to 30 hours to render a single frame of the movie. It took over 100 million CPU hours to create Monster University. So if you use just one CPU to do that, like they used to do in the previous times when they'd use laptops or beefy servers, it would have taken about 10,000 years to finish. So probably we wouldn't have that movie. So they took 4 years in all to do it. So one of the things I think that many of you have seen is The Lion King, and that is so realistic that I don't even show it because people think it's an actual movie. It uses virtual reality. Then there's this, of course, which I think everyone has seen. This is a feat of computing. It's a feat of telescopes. It's a feat of data. And it's a feat of thousands and thousands of people putting all of this together. And the quote always is, we've now seen the unseen, from a researcher at the University of Waterloo. And this also ties into something I'm not going to get into, but you need to have a lot of people working together to get these things done, to understand it, to understand the science, to understand the machines. This is no longer one person sitting and running a simulation on their computer. So just because I said a lot of these concerns that I brought up are addressable. Some of it is you just need to live with the fact that if you want the benefits, you're trading data, right? And we know that with Google and with Amazon and with all of these, you're not the customer, you're the product. We get this stuff for free, basically, and this is the price we pay. But if you look at this list, and workforce development is how funding agencies call training and education for next generations of researchers, of people who know how to build supercomputers, people who know how to code them, and how to secure them. So when you look at this whole list, everything except for the last 2 or 3 are actually about people. And in reality, all of the last 3 are also about people, because you need people to do them. So one of the things that comes up, and I've talked a lot about, is the ethics. You did not need an ethics consultant when you were running a simulation of weather, right? But now the fact that software developers are being put in the position of being ethics professionals or experts is something that we all need to be thinking about, because there are people who need to think about, can this be done and how do we do it? But there are people who need to think about, should this be done? And the other thing is we need a lot of new people and resources for data, because this is all about data, even if you're just thinking about the big major simulations that are physics only. The scaling up of it, quantum computers could be a whole season of Saturday morning physics, but they just as a point, because people probably know, but definitely should know, quantum computers are never going to be general purpose machines like Summit is, or like these other computers I've shown you. They will be very good when we have them, and Google for a second had something out that said that they'd actually created something, and then they pulled it off their website a short while ago, and said that they could do something that Summit could not do in 10,000 years or something like that. But when they come out, they will be very good at doing specific things. But they will be specific things. They won't be general purpose. So we'll still be having the Summits and the ones on our campuses to do all these other general things. And diversity, because that's one of the things I care about deeply, but our community needs to care about. And you've seen these examples of why diversity is important, because otherwise you're not included in the data that's being used to build, or in the people that are being used to build all these things that you use every day. So diversity in supercomputing is fairly dismal. It has to do with diversity in STEM being not as great as we would like. The annual supercomputing conference has researchers all the way through people who do network work, or who build supercomputers, or people like me who are paid to think about this kind of thing. It's going to be interesting. Actually, the number there is from SC Supercomputing 2017, not 18. Anecdotally, I've been told it's the same in 2018, so 13%. Yet we want to get to 20% female attendees in a year, basically. And that includes vendor booth staff. A lot of sales people are women, and they get counted in. So what are we doing as a community? We're trying to do a lot of things about this. And when I say community, I say the broader community, because it's important. But the two things I would pull out from this is it's about inclusion and equity. I know this is very different from what I've been talking about, but it's about inclusion and equity. It's not just about diversity. Saying we've got 20% women is great, but can you retain them? Do you have people with a broad diversity? Do you have people with disabilities? Do you have people from different racial and ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds? All these things are important because it needs to reflect society if you're building tools for society. But if you can't retain, you better not talk about percentage that you've recruited, basically. And then just remembering always, this is a societal problem. We should all care about it, because products that are built by diverse teams are better for all of us. It's not just it's the right thing to do kind of thing. We should all care about it. It shouldn't be on women to care about diversity of women, and people of color to care about people of color. It is a societal thing, so we really have to think about it that way. And I believe that was my last slide. I'd be interested in hearing comments about what people think is what makes supercomputing so super after I've done this quick run through. I do have some ideas of what my opinions are on that. And in general, I will be happy to take any and all kinds of questions, and I may be able to answer some of them.